Hello, my friends. Miss Surrett back again to talk to you this time about the Roaring Twenties, which is the time period that comes after World War I, where we're going to see a lot of social changes and a lot of economic booms. A lot of changes going on in this time period. And, people are happy. The Great War is over, and they're sort of feeling like we're never going to have another one of those wars. So let's enjoy ourselves. Let's party. So you're going to see a lot of changes in this time period. One of the big changes is from Henry Ford, developer of the Model T Ford, which is this car right here. And I don't know if you've ever ridden in one. My grandfather actually owned a Model T Ford, and they are extremely hard to drive. I was never able to do it. They use something called a double clutch system, which requires you to push in the clutch, change the gear, pop the clutch, move the whole thing. It was really difficult, but they were kind of fun to tool around in it. Their top speed of 30 miles an hour. The Model T Ford came out of the Ford Motor Company, which was developed in 1903. And then the car itself came out in 1908. And Henry Ford was not only an innovator for making the car, but also in what he did to make the car. He's called the father of mass production because Henry Ford realized that if one person or a group of people worked together to make one car, it was going to take forever. So instead he comes up with the assembly line idea, or he borrows the assembly line idea, I should say. And these parts come down a conveyor belt, and there's small sections, and people put together the small sections until they get bigger and bigger, and then they're putting together a car. But he's smart. He realizes that if each person does one job over and over again, they're going to become an expert at that job. So for example, if your job is to create the rear view mirror and that's all you do, you're going to get faster and faster and better at it. And so that's going to speed up production overall. Everyone has the same job. But one of the things I really like about Ford is he kind of realized this is mind numbing. I mean, sticking the button on, sticking the button on, sticking the button on. And he knew that if people were going to stay and do the job, and he really needed them to stay so that they would get better and faster, he needed to compensate them. And he actually took pretty good care of his workers, which was unusual at that time. They're using the assembly line is creating mass production, which allows for the high production of goods at a cheap cost, which brings the cost down. So more and more people can afford to buy a car. And this is going to have a huge impact. And I'll show you in a moment here. People are now able to afford cars, just regular people like you and me, not like really wealthy people. And not only because of the cheaper cost of the car, but also because Ford was pretty smart. Instead of saying to you, you have to give me all the money for the car up front, he allowed weekly payments. You just keep paying a little bit each week until you've paid for the car. So this revolutionizes American life. Now people can travel. They can go see their family. They can go on extended trips. They don't have to worry, well, who can I stay with? Because now you're starting to see new industries springing up, including motels, service facilities, filling stations. And by the end of the 20s, you're seeing one car on the road for every 5 people. So that means families are enjoying cars. And this is really changing the American way of life. People can move from place to place. In fact, one of the big changes it made was Buckhead became, if you know anything about Atlanta, there is a suburb called Buckhead, which is almost its own city now. And that suburb grew because of the car. People could commute from Atlanta to Buckhead. So if you don't know where that is, check it out on a map. It's kind of interesting how the car really developed our own backyard. Now, another thing you're seeing at this time period is the Red Scare, which refers to communism. Communism, in 1919, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks set up a communist state in Russia, which is one of the reasons why they didn't want them in the League of Nations, because communism was an economic and political system. It's ruled by a dictator, and it basically says there is no private property. The people own everything. The people own the work, the people own the government, and everybody gets a share of that. And that's kind of an antithesis to the American concept of capitalism, which is the harder I work, the more I get, although there are those who would argue against that as well. But that's kind of where Americans felt like that's sort of weird that a person can't own a factory, that all the workers own the factory. So people were kind of watching this apprehensively. But in the United States, some people said, that's not such a bad thing, you know? Maybe we could have a communist party. And you see some people joining the industrial workers of the world, and they're coming into the Communist Party. And so at first people are kind of like, I don't know what's going on with this. But then someone mails bombs to government and businesses. And people start to say, oh, whoa, wait a minute. Maybe these communists are trying to take over just like they did in Russia. Here's Lenin proudly leading the Bolsheviks and the communists in Russia. So maybe they're trying to do the same thing here. And what if they're going to try to take over and they want to take away all of our factories and our work? So this becomes a big a scare, and it turns into a conspiracy here, and people are really worried about it. So the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, actually tries to take action and begins to try to convict people of attacking the government and trying to overthrow the government and communism. And the thing about the Red Scare is that it feeds a fear of foreigners. Obviously, it must be foreigners bringing this in because no red-blooded American would do that. And that's kind of what people start to think, is that it must be immigrants who are bringing this in. Also, if you get accused of being a communist, even if you're not, it completely ruins your reputation and it'll wreck your life. And you might go to court and they might say, oh, no, this person is not a communist. This person has not tried to attack or overthrow the government, but it's too late. It kind of comes to a head in 1920 when I don't know if that's Sacco or Sacco, and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants, are arrested and charged with robbery and murder. Now, they are anarchists. They are proclaimed anarchists, which means that they don't believe in law. But the charges that they're arrested for, the trial goes and cannot find guilt for them. They can't be proved guilty. I mean, it's very flimsy, and it becomes pretty obvious to a lot of people that he's just trying to find a scapegoat, that Palmer is just trying to make these guys look bad. But the jury is so scared about the potential of communism that they go ahead and find them guilty. And people in the United States and Paris and London, all around the world, begin protesting against this. And so a commission is set up, and the commission comes back and says, nope, we agree, they must have done it. So they are executed in 1927, but there's never been anything to indicate that they were actually guilty of being accused of overthrowing the government and communism. Now, it's known as the Red Scare because red is considered the color of the communist flag. So people said, oh, well, if you're red, you must be communist. But this fear of communism becomes an international thing. You see it all across the countries like France and Great Britain and different places. So there sets up this real us versus them, the capitalists versus the communists, the free countries versus the communist country. And you'll see that more as we continue studying. Now, of course, right now there's a lot of anti-immigrant attitudes going on. The nativists, you remember we've talked about them before, they're saying, as usual, that immigrants are taking the jobs, and so we need to have fewer immigrants coming in. But they're also adding to this concept that the immigrants are bringing in the anarchy and the socialism and the communism. So there's a lot of anger to fuel and a lot of restrictions on immigration because of this. In the meantime, African Americans are experiencing a huge cultural growth in this time period. This is Langston Hughes. He's a poet. You may have read Raisin in the Sun that he wrote. Americans see women entering new roles in the workplace. They see mass media, the radio, shows like Little Orphan Annie are becoming very popular. And so people are finding new outlets for entertainment. And the Harlem Renaissance is really the signal of the flourishing of African American culture in this time period. It's coming out of a place in New York known as Harlem. Harlem is the world's largest black urban area. You've got people from the United States, former families who came over as slaves. You've got Caribbean immigrants coming in. And so this is where many of these, of the African American people are congregating. And you've got a literary, artistic movement and an expression and pride in being African American. I mean, this is kind of the first time African Americans have found their voice since slavery really took it away from them. And then, of course, after Reconstruction, they're not really ever given a chance to find a voice. Langston Hughes was a preeminent poet of this time, and his works describe difficult lives of the working class. And he would write his poems to kind of be read to music or to kind of have the feeling of jazz or blues. And here you go, the raisin in the sun that I mentioned before. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So you can see the issues of the working class, what happens to the people who aren't able to live out their dreams. Jazz was born in this time period in the 20th century in New Orleans, and it spreads across the United States. And I don't have a picture of our friend Satchmo, but Louis Armstrong was known as Satchmo, or the Great One. He was a trumpeter, and he really makes personal expression a key part of jazz. You know, really kind of takes over and owns this piece of jazz. And he's one of the most influential musicians in jazz history. Sorry. Here we have Duke Ellington, Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington, who is a jazz pianist and orchestra leader, and he becomes one of America's great composers. Another great composer of this time is Irving Berlin, a Russian-born American musical composer, and he lived in an area that became known as Tin Pan Alley. It was in New York City, and it was a center of music for about 30 years. And he wrote a number of famous songs, thousands of them, but you know perhaps God Bless America or White Christmas, sung by Bing Crosby in White Christmas. So Irving Berlin becomes a very famous composer at this time too. So you see a large resurgence in culture in various groups. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought there for a moment. So the Roaring Twenties is really a time of expression. It's a time of creativity. You could talk about the flappers. You can talk about the men and women who are trying to kind of escape and lose themselves in joy, if you will, in enjoying themselves, especially after the difficulty of the war. All right, my friends, that does it for this unit. I will be hopefully seeing you in class, and make sure that you check out some of the other resources we've put in there in the content for you.